So I'm very fortunate to have here today to discuss Victoria and the energy transition, Jonathan Spear, the Chief Executive Officer for Infrastructure Victoria. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the recent report that Infrastructure Victoria put out towards 2050 gas infrastructure in a net zero emissions economy. So I'll let you give a bit of an introduction on that, Jonathan, and then we'll go into a few questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you. It's it's the last session, so we definitely need some energy. So let's talk energy, right? Of course, there's been lots of discussion across the day about energy. I wanted to dive perhaps into an area that gets a little bit less attention, at least when we think about the long term. And as Andrew alluded to, that is the role of gas in the energy transition. When you step back a couple of steps, of course, Victoria and other jurisdictions have got emissions targets and they're legislated, and we're all working towards those. And we're making some pretty good progress in some areas, especially in electricity generation. While the challenges of doing that have been discussed today, we're on a pathway. There's two other sectors, though, that are pretty challenging for us to actually meet our targets. So the transport sector, where about 20% of our emissions are, and in a Victorian context, about 20% of our emissions are from natural gas. So if we don't reduce the emissions from our natural gas use, we don't get to net zero. That's our starting point. Now, there's been a lot of discussion recently about some of the relatively short-term challenges around gas supply, and some of the speakers we've had today and others who are experts in the energy system are probably better placed to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the longer term trajectory, because that's the question that we were put when the Victorian government asked Infrastructure Victoria for independent advice about the gas transition. And so how do we sort through some of the uncertainties and pathways about getting to net zero with a state that is really heavily reliant on gas? So we have about 2 million households and businesses that currently are connected to natural gas. And so we're more reliant than any other state, and it's particularly for things like heating our homes and businesses, so space heating and water heating, but also some commercial and industrial uses as well. And that's the challenge, is how do we go from that state to a net zero state, and how do we do it fast enough? And we're at the start of a conversation, so a lot of people kind of don't get, and we talk to the community about this, they don't really get the challenge that's here. But what we were able to do is do some independent whole of state assessment about what the opportunities and pathways were. We did a whole lot of modelling of different scenarios, which looked at both the electricity, the transport and the gas sector and the way in which they might transition to net zero. We looked at all the infrastructure, all the kit we've got, and what state it's in now, and how it's going to be in the future, and whether it can actually take some of the renewable gases that everyone's interested in, like hydrogen and biogas. And we looked at what some of the best energy efficiency opportunities there are for households and also for businesses and industrial applications. And through doing that, we're able to come up with a contribution to the Victorian government's roadmap to getting to net zero with gas. And we might dig into some of this a little bit more, perhaps, Andrew, but there's some no-brainers, if you like, that we want to apply in the energy transition that are particularly important for supporting the gas transition. So it's things like even greater investment in energy efficiency, targeted early investment and transition to electrify things like space heaters and water heaters and some of the industrial applications where there's already the technology to shift to technology that's going to be cheaper to run and net zero. And this is the decade that we want to try out and test green hydrogen and biogas in a Victorian context, and particularly in the regions that are best set up for it, because we're going to need by the end of this decade to make a call about whether all the enthusiasm there is for green hydrogen and biogas is going to be translatable into reality, because then we've got a couple of decades that we've got to go really hard in making that transition real. And so we can't wait forever, but this is a decade to start reducing the reliance we have on natural gas so that what we have remained can be used by those who can't substitute it easily, and to inform the decisions we're going to need to make in coming decades.
Great, thanks for the introduction, and I think you already answered one of the questions from the floor, which was around what do we do about replacing gas in households, and you talked about electrification, and of course there's a lot more heat pump technology now, but I guess the implications of that for the use of the gas network, you mentioned the potential shift to hydrogen possibly, but I'd like to drill down into that a bit more about what the technical scope for that is, because the sort of 10% hydrogen blending that we hear about at the moment doesn't cut emissions very much. How much scope is there to go a lot further to all hydrogen, for example?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there is talk about blending 10% hydrogen, but it doesn't get to us to an end state. It's really interesting to start develop a market and develop a capacity, but what we really need to know is what's the degree to which we can substitute energy demand from natural gas to green hydrogen. And we're talking green hydrogen here largely because that's where we get the emissions reductions that we're really interested in. Now, of course, we know that technically, we can create green hydrogen. Most of us have done it at school and probably caused some heartache to our science teachers about whether we're going to blow the place up. So we can. The question is whether we can generate enough of it, both with the renewable energy and water inputs we need, but also at a price that's competitive with the alternative of renewable electricity. Then there's the question of compatibility of hydrogen with the pipes, right? So that's one of the things we did a detailed study on, and an independent study, but we also talked a lot to the owners and operators of gas transmission and distribution pipelines. And a lot of the gas distribution network, with a little bit of tinkering, will be compatible with hydrogen. The trick is the need to turn over appliances over a period of time. Perhaps the bigger challenge is that some of the transmission pipelines are not compatible with 100% hydrogen use without really significant change. But that may not matter. And why I say that is because it could be that in the future where we generate and use gases might actually be a far more local thing. Just like we have been going through a transition with electricity from a centralised generation and transmission to a usage source, to a more distributed network, that could well be the same answer for gas. So it could be that we're creating renewable hydrogen or biogas in different regions of Victoria that are better suited to those with more local demands. And it could mean that under some of our scenarios that we modelled, you actually need a lot less of that the gas transmission network than we currently have.
Thanks. And you mentioned electricity and the use of gas in electricity, I think, earlier as well. Just drilling down there in the work you did there, what did you see as the role for gas longer term, for particularly in peaking, for firming renewables, for example?
Yeah, so all of the scenarios we modelled had some natural gas left in the system even when we get out to 2050. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, which is that there's a lot of effort that we can make to move gas demand away to either renewable gases or renewable electricity, but there's some gas peaking that is going to be necessary, perhaps in short instances, and also some industrial uses where there's natural gas requirements still. But in all of our scenarios, we see a greater use of renewable electricity, and then varying levels of renewable gas in the form of green hydrogen and biogas, and then some natural gas remaining even out to 2050. And we're not alone in reaching that conclusion. A number of other studies have come to a similar conclusion. This is the decade that we really need to start taking action where we can reduce our energy demand overall with more efficient appliances and energy efficiency in our homes and buildings, and test out the substitutability of these renewable gases, we are going to need some natural gas through to 2050.
That's really interesting, thanks. And a question from the floor comes back to this electrification point. And the question is, given that Australians have been convinced over many years that gas is the cheap green option, and certainly emissions are less than burning coal for generation, what needs to be done now to bring the community along for the need for electrification?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that have happened in recent times that have improved the community's understanding of this issue, right? So part of it is, of course, the significant increase in gas prices has made people start to think about this, and there's been a lot of good public science communication about this as well. But there is a real role for government policy settings in terms of the degree to which we incentivise people to take up more efficient electric appliances. And this is going to have to happen over time, right? So like any technology transition where you've got a whole lot of currently gas-using appliances, when it breaks down between now and the next couple of decades, the choice that should be incentivised is one around changing to an efficient, in most instances, electric appliance. And part of it also is at the sales point. And I've had some really interesting discussions with property industry and trade industries about the opportunities that they have to build up their workforce skills and their knowledge of this energy transition to, often it's heat pumps in a domestic setting.
Those long investment lead times are really important. So that's certainly something the International Energy Agency's pushed. I've got probably time for one very last question. I don't want to stand in the way of people of their Friday afternoon drinks. So, I mean, you talk about this shift to electrification. Does that then raise the risk of stranding of gas pipeline assets? And sort of what's the time frame for confronting that potential issue?
Yeah, so we are acutely aware of the risk of stranded assets, and it's one of the things that we are interested in getting to independently get to the bottom of the state of current assets and their capacity to utilise other gases like hydrogen and biogas. And that's one of the reasons we say this is the decade to test out the viability and the use cases for those gases. But also the thing we've called out for the Victorian government to consider is what their policy settings are around allowing of additional connections of gas. Now, what they've done is that they've changed regulations on the basis of our advice, which was to not make mandatory connection of new households to the gas network, which is a start to reduce the risk of stranded assets. There's going to come a point over the next decade where another decision has to be made, which is the degree to which additional extension and investment in gas assets makes sense both for owners of those assets and the communities and users of them as well.
Great, thanks very much, Jonathan. It's been fascinating having this conversation. There are questions from the floor about nuclear, about offshore wind. We could keep going all afternoon, but we want to let people go, so it just remains to say thank you very much and pass on to our CEO, Melinda, to close up.
Thanks, Andrew.